Good evening. Tonight's presentation will take you into the special world of a man who was a respected mineralogist, an esteemed naturalist, and a talented artist. He was also a philosopher and an idealist, and he was Norway's own. George Lorenzo Noyes was born in the village of Norway in August of 1863. If I may, I'd like to place that year in some historical context. The Battle of Gettysburg took place just a month before. America's Civil War, having raged for nearly 2.5 years, would continue for another year and a half before peace ensued. George, or Shavey as he was later nicknamed, was the son of Anna Chase and Oscar Amos Noyes. The Noyes family owned and operated an apothecary and stationery store on Main Street, Norway. George's father was a most successful proprietor. He was respected and popular within his community. He served as the town treasurer and was active in the Masons and the Knights of Pythias. He also traveled a lot on business. Around 1870, a surprise was added to the family. Oscar Noyes brought home his biological infant daughter, Della May. Della was accepted into the family and adopted by both Oscar and his wife. I would like to add a footnote here. Della May would live to be 101 years old, the oldest resident in Oxford County at the time of her passing. There appears to be scant information on George Noyes' early years. With his father running a prosperous store and traveling a lot on business, little time was left to be with his young children. It was said that Oscar took young George fishing, but only once. As a result, George was closer to his mother and to his grandfather Chase. They had a greater influence in his upbringing. They would help young George discover and embrace the natural world around him and the spiritual solitude found there.
My mother, to me, her entire life brings scenes of the mountains. She always told me of her child days lived amid the mountains, and after I was born, every summer I was taken to her old homestead along the Saco River Valley, Freiburg, and I had my child days in the very scenes she had lived her young days. And my grandfather Chase told me of all his years with these very same scenes. Grandfather Chase was a hunter and a fisherman and a ranger. And I can only tell you little things by words, for language does not convey what I would like to impart to you, my dear human brother and sister and all your relation. And I would like to tell things to your dog about my dogs I had for companions.
In 1878, George's father died at the early age of 41. I couldn't discover the cause of Oscar's death, but in reviewing his 1878 diary, I noticed he made fewer and eventually no entries in his last months. The few entries he made only dealt with business commitments. His usual observations about weather and how business was doing were missing. He no longer mentioned family life. Perhaps his lack of attention to his diary suggests he had been unwell for some time. From probate records I examined, I discovered Oscar had acquired a modest wealth that would help secure the family for a number of years. His widow, Anna, continued to run the drugstore until May of 1894, when much of downtown Norway was destroyed by fire. With unusually high winds, this devastating fire quickly consumed one building after another on Main Street. The Noyes drugstore was not spared. However, in short time, the business district was rebuilt. The Noyes drugstore was also rebuilt and opened the following spring. Details about George's formal education are lacking. What is known comes from the United States Census records. The 1880 census shows George attending school the year he turned 16, and the 1940 census shows he completed the 10th grade. Living in the village, he most likely attended high school at what was once called the Norway Liberal Institute. I'd like to include an historic note here. The Liberal Institute was also destroyed by the Great Fire of 1894. A similar school was built on the site to replace the lost structure. It became known as the Yellow Schoolhouse. In 1985, it too was razed to make room for the addition to the Guy Rose School. George was not an indoors person. He much preferred the outdoors. He enjoyed exploring the woods, the rivers, and the lakes, but especially the mountains. It's not hard to imagine this young man's frustration of being confined to crowded classrooms. Perhaps he regularly played hooky to explore his outdoor world. With his 10 years of formal education, he was now ready to expand his understanding of his natural world. It would prepare him for his later talents as a writer, naturalist, mineral collector, and an artist. George acquired the nickname Shavey, but we don't know how or when. Some have suggested that the name was given when he was young. In those days, it was common to refer to children as little shavers. A more likely possibility was that he was nicknamed for Shave Hill, a large hill in the town of Lovell, where his grandmother Chase was born. I can easily imagine his grandfather Chase taking young George up this very hill to observe the panoramic view of the White Mountains. These mountains would go on to forever capture his imagination and to inspire his artistic and writing talents. In 1885, George Noyes married Isabel Smith. He was 22 years old, his bride 18. Their marriage took place in Lower Bartlett, New Hampshire, at the base of the White Mountains. They would go on to have two children. Their first died in infancy. Their second child, Max Gordon, was born in 1900. George and Isabel remained together for about 20 years, separating around 1905. I could not discover the reason for George and Isabel's separation, but I will speculate on a possible cause. Shady was always drawn to exploring the White Mountains. His adventures would take him away from home and family for days or even weeks at a time. The White Mountains were visibly present at his wedding, and perhaps even then they were beckoning him. Could these mountains have become a figurative lifelong mistress that Isabel couldn't compete with? We may never know. The Mineralogist. In the later 1800s, dozens of quarries were opened in Oxford County. They were worked for their unique and often rare gem quality minerals. Many of these mines continued their operations well into the 20th century. One such quarry was the Harvard Quarry. It is located at the top of Noyes Mountain in Greenwood. The mountain, formerly Stevens Mountain, is believed to be renamed for Shavey's grandfather, Captain Amos F. Noyes, a Civil War veteran. Aware of the valuable mineral composition at the top, Shady purchased a portion of the upper mountain from his distant cousin, Isaac Noyes. In the 1890s, he and his friend Tim Heath, a stonemason, began mining semi-precious gemstones and other rare minerals. Some of the dozens of different minerals extracted from his quarry included green tourmalines, fluorapatite, lepidolite, and quartz crystals. Although Shady sold some of the gem quality minerals to dealers, he appeared more interested in donating his mineral specimens to museums throughout the country, including Harvard University's Mineral Museum.
With dealers, all is just the money they will fetch. That is the least expression of man. And not only in minerals, but in other things where trade is connected with the spirit of anything beautiful.
After his death, his friend Robert Bickford, a gem cutter, purchased the remaining minerals and gems that were once Shavy's collection. Today, there are almost 24 quarries in Oxford County. They attract mineral and gem collectors from around the world. Many of them are opened only to groups by invitation. But the Harvard Quarry is readily accessible. The tract is now owned by the Western Foothills Land Trust. Access to the quarry is made from the trailhead off Richardson Hollow Road in Greenwood. Depending on which trails are taken, it is about a 3-mile round trip and is rated a moderate hike. Once reaching the summit, you will find spectacular views of Oxford County and beyond. The views today are nearly identical to what Shavey saw 100 years ago. And while visiting the mountain and its quarries, you might be lucky enough to find a prized tourmaline. The Naturalist and the Artist. It's very difficult to talk about Shady Noyes, the naturalist, without some discussion about his friend George Howe, the other esteemed naturalist of Norway. In 1910, the Boy Scouts of America was founded. 2 years later, the Girl Scouts of America was formed. But throughout the country, there were earlier predecessors. One such group was founded here in Norway by George Robley Howe. George, or Uncle George as he was known to his young students, grew up with Shavey in Norway on Main Street. He later attended Tufts University in Massachusetts. For reasons unknown, he left Tufts after 3 years without graduating. George Howe worked briefly at various jobs in Cincinnati, New York City, and Hartford. While in Connecticut, he married Emma Boardman, a daughter of a prominent tea and coffee merchant. In 1888, he brought his wife to Norway and started working for his father's insurance company. In 1893, Emma abruptly abandoned George and went back to Connecticut with their only daughter. For him, the following year was also devastating. The Great Fire of 1894 destroyed much of downtown Norway. He and his father had the difficult task of settling numerous insurance claims from destroyed businesses. But around this time, George Howe became increasingly interested in collecting gems from around Oxford County. He also studied various disciplines of natural history. George was acquiring the same interests and proficiencies that Shavey already had in the natural sciences. Before long, George and Shady would be collaborating on an incredibly successful project. George had observed how many of the town's children lacked constructive purpose in their lives. This was especially true during the summer months when school was not in session. He wondered if there was something he could do to give Norway's children more direction and purpose. He was determined to do something that would provide a healthy and fun learning environment for them. Having acquired a strong background in mineralogy and a solid reputation as a naturalist, George Howe realized he was well suited to teach the town's young children about the natural sciences. He would accomplish this with a series of organized field trips. Around 1899, with Shady's assistance, George Robley Howe formed a small youth group called the Boy Scientists. In time, the group became known as the Norway Boys Natural History Club. George had finally found a new family that would last for the rest of his life. The first youth group was formed with about 10 students. Many of the field trips were planned for the purpose of observing and collecting plant and animal specimens. Children would identify and later classify what they found. There were also excursions to some of the many mineral quarries found in Oxford County. Other disciplines in the natural sciences, such as astronomy, were also included. Students were expected to maintain a logbook of what they observed. The young scientists were equipped with specially designed knapsacks to hold their specimens and logbooks. With his artistic abilities, Shavey guided students to make accurate sketches of their field observations. By 1905, the club grew so large it had to be divided into new groups according to age. Some field trips were only a day long. One such excursion, reported in the Oxford Democrat, was to a quarry on Streaked Mountain. Other trips were ambitious overnighters where students brought tents and other camping equipment. With their mutual backgrounds as naturalists, Shavey and Uncle George formed an enduring partnership that successfully led the groups. Later, girls were included in some of the programs. As the group of young naturalists became more prominent, newspaper reporters from Boston and as far away as San Francisco reported on this remarkable youth organization. In 1905, the Boston Herald ran a feature on a 3-day excursion to Stoneham. Later that year, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a full-page article about George and Shavey's young scientists. It was titled, "Vacation Study That is Vacation Fun." The photos from the article showed the boys involved in various outdoor activities, from hiking to prospecting for minerals to taking field notes. The Boys Natural History Club did not create the Boy Scouts of America in 1910. It was, however, an important predecessor that helped lead the way for a nationwide movement. We have Uncle George and Shavey to thank for their important contributions to the Scouting movement. The Artist and the Philosopher. J.B. Noyes is perhaps best remembered for his artistic talents as found in his paintings and the countless sketches he made during his travels into the White Mountains. A common story often told was that in the summer of 1890, Shavey visited an artist colony in North Conway. It is said that there he met the famed landscape artist Benjamin Champney. He became inspired. He too would become a landscape artist. Shady would have been 27 years old at that time. While there is little doubt that he visited the famed artist in 1890, my research suggests his artistic interests were inspired by Champney years earlier. In July of 1913, the Boston Sunday Herald ran an extensive feature article on Norway's notables. Included was a lengthy section about Shavey Noyes' life and what led him to become a landscape artist. I will quote from the paper's story. The lad, Shavey, was only 10 years old when he stole up behind Benjamin Champney, the landscape artist, and watched the colors as they were applied. There, the lad muttered to himself, is a man doing what he likes. If the article quoted accurately, then Shavey Noyes' inspiration to become a landscape artist occurred many years earlier when he was only a young boy. Over the next several decades, Shady would sketch natural landscapes, mostly of his beloved mountains. His sketches, done in pencil or ink, were noted for their attention to detail. His renderings were typically devoid of people. When viewing his sketches, one is struck by the heavy contrast of dark and light, a technique that intensifies the importance of objects in the landscape. His sketches were often portrayed with a sense of foreboding and stark loneliness. Very few pictures showed clear skies, or rather storm clouds or fog being common. In 1917, Shavey had the privilege to exhibit many of his sketches at the renowned Eric Print Gallery in New York City. Some of the titles of his sketches were The Gathering Storm, The Flight of Fog, Gathering Gloom, and The Wrath of the Elements. These titles reflected the typically somber mood created by his 52 renderings that were on display. In the many hundreds of pencil and ink wash sketches created, Shavey Noyes captured his feelings as he observed the various landscapes. However, many of his sketches did not exist merely as solitary renderings. They were instead a part of the extensive and detailed journals he kept. In 1989, Bruce Richards, a Norway resident, published a book with hundreds of pages from Shavey's journals, dating from 1916 to 1923. The journals, with their many sketches, captured not only what Shavey observed of his beloved landscapes, They also revealed his very personal relationship with his natural surroundings. They further revealed his views on a wide range of topics, such as religion, greed, social norms of the day, and war. His writings at times appeared deeply philosophical. They were sometimes poetic. Other times they appeared cryptic. They could also be humorous and witty, or they could be biting with sarcastic irony. Throughout his journals, there is seldom a date provided, and the full names of people were rarely mentioned.
Dear Addie, I am sending you another log cabin sketch. There seems to be no people about my pictures running in and out, so busy, etc. But we will let the people alone and not put them in the pictures, for people change in style and manners, so it would be very hard for me to keep track of them.
On religion, Shavey appeared distrustful of organized religions and their houses of worship. He had, however, a deep spiritual faith derived from the natural world, especially from the mountains he spent so much time in.
Religion, oh God, no, never is it there in those confines. And all this stuff, this human stuff of human ideas of changing human beings.
On war, to say the least, Shavey was no supporter of war. Here is a quote from him, complete with his characteristic sarcasm. It's in response to the American soldiers being sent overseas during the First World War.
Great God, man alive. Just think what history will record of the Americans going and joining their brother men over the seas. The greatest event on this beautiful earth. And the impressions on the children overseas. What an international brotherhood. They call, and the boys respond. Another call came. The boys came from the woods, the farms, the villages. They go tomorrow morning. War. You don't have to beat the bush to get these boys. My boy left this morning, long before light. I spoke to him about him being a boy 17 years of age, and said perhaps they will put you in the back somewhere. He turned on me and said, by God, I know what I am going for. He went.
In 1918, his son, Max Gordon, joined the Army and was sent over to France. He served in the Army's balloon squadrons. These squadrons used manned dirigibles filled with hydrogen as observation balloons. Tethered to the ground for later retrieval, soldiers were sent up in the balloons to observe enemy lines. They were easy targets for snipers and enemy airplanes, and many were shot down. I recently found a copy of Max's obituary and learned that he was an aviator during the war. Although his service record indicates his primary duty as ambulance driver for the balloon squadrons, he very likely was a spotter in these fragile balloons, and that would make him an aviator. Near the end of hostilities, Max had the misfortune of being captured and held as a prisoner of war. On perfection,
Never try to do all things perfect, or if you do, you won't have time for leeway, fishing, leisure, talking with children, and good dogs.
and Shady loved dogs. He was especially fond of his dog Tige, named after Buster Brown's companion. On living things belonging to the earth,
Our tame pigeon went direct to heaven this morning. I buried her body in the flower garden, so there will be no break in the relation of things, the things that belong to the earth and are of the earth.
many of Shavy's excursions into the wilderness and mountains lasted for days or weeks at a time. He traveled lightly and was dependent on water and food found along the way. This required special creativity to satisfy both his thirst and hunger. On what to drink in the wilderness.
We should give thanks for our protected ignorance. I have drank water from some very muddy places. Had I been educated along the lines of biology, the chances would be I would have suffered with thirst.
On what to eat in the wilderness.
I have eaten some very out of style things, such as frog eggs, reindeer moss, roots, ferns, grasshoppers cooked in a corn popper, and fox meat.
Later in life and beyond. Shavey had a number of hobbies. He collected valuable and rare minerals from local rock quarries, including his own quarry on Noyes Mountain. He loved drawing, whether it was in pencil or by the more elaborate ink wash technique. It remained a lifetime devotion. He was a passionate hiker who roamed not only the hills and mountains of Maine, but also the White Mountains of New Hampshire. In his many explorations, especially along Lake Penissiwasi and the Saco River in Freiburg, he searched out and collected Native American artifacts. But I think his most unusual hobby was the building of rock cairns, thousands of rock cairns. According to the local newspaper, wherever he went hiking, if rocks were available, he would build these loose stone monuments. They were constructed throughout the White Mountains. They were found over in Freiburg on Streakin Mountain. They were built on Pikes Hill and along Lake Penissiwasi. Some stood more than 6 feet in height. These cairns were and are typically used to mark trails that can't be easily followed. If you have ever hiked along the top of the Presidential Range, where you are above the tree line and it's a bit foggy, you know they serve as a welcome beacon. They also have a whimsical side that comes from the builder. They announce, "I was here." And Shady was indeed here and everywhere. In the early 1930s, Shavey lost a leg to infection. Although fitted with a prosthesis, it effectively ended the strenuous activities he was accustomed to. He continued to live with his sister, Della May, who assisted him for the next 14 years of his life. In those later years, he was often seen in town, sometimes near his sister's home at 149 Main Street. It is said he could also often be found in front of Stone's drugstore. Perhaps some, who didn't know him, would take notice of the now frail man sitting along the sidewalk in front of some store or shop as traffic slowly went by on Main Street. They might wonder if this old and rumpled man was homeless, or if he was a bit lazy, or if he lacked the wit of a younger man, or perhaps he was one they should feel sorry for. They would be wrong, of course, on all accounts. Shady lived an incredible life that few of us could ever achieve. A local landscape artist, a naturalist, a philosopher, and a passionate hiker. Here's a story about Shady from his later years that I think is worth repeating. It is from Lewis Keene's book, Boyhood Life on a Maine Farm. It reads, "Bear in mind that most city visitors during the summer are delightful people whom we look forward to meeting. The woman in this story was the exception. They say Shavey stood leaning against Stone's drugstore on a warm, sunny afternoon, his old wide-rimmed hat pulled low over his blue eyes. A New York car pulled up to the curb beside him, and a woman, fair and 40ish, climbed out and crossed the sidewalk and began talking to him. She rolled her I's and her R's. She was quite coquettish. 'You are a native,' she purred. 'I know it from your looks. The village people are so quaint. I adore them. It is so nice for them to have us from the great outside world to bring them culture and news and, oh, everything in the summer. It must be terrible here in the winter, everything blocked with snow, I suppose. She rambled on and on. Shavey took it pretty well until she turned to go. She asked one last question. And what do you all do when we leave in the fall? Shavey straightened, set his old hat on the back of his head, looked her full in the eyes, and answered, We fumigate. Shavey never lost his pride, and he never lost his wit. George Lorenzo Noyes died in April of 1945. He was 81. Shavey was interred in the Norway Pine Grove Cemetery. I recently visited his grave where he is buried alongside his father, Oscar, his mother, Anna, and his half-sister, Della Mae. His resting place is marked with a small, simple stone. Perhaps the small, understated stone misses the importance of this rather incredible person from Norway. Perhaps he should have merited a larger stone. Or perhaps a person of his stature and legacy just doesn't need one.